President Biden will hold a video call with Russian President Vladimir Putin today amid tensions over Ukraine. Mr. Biden is expected to share concerns about Russia's increased military presence at the border with Ukraine. And last night, the president contacted key NATO allies to discuss the issue. The U.S. has warned that if Russia does invade Ukraine, it could face consequences. So Michael Bociurkiw joins us now. He's a global affairs analyst and former spokesperson for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael. So we have seen this happen before, actually. It's been happening sort of continuously for a while, where Russia is building up troops along the border. But recently, Russia has been doing some other things, moving troops overnight, moves that are making people very concerned. There is speculation that the president will warn Putin that if he orders an invasion of Ukraine, that Western allies may cut Russia off from the international financial system, which sounds huge to me. Can we talk about the impact of that?
Sure. Good to be with you again, Anne-Marie. Well, yeah, I mean, removing Russia from the international payment system, the so-called SWIFT system, is something I've been advocating for a long time. I call it the nuclear option, and it would literally paralyze Russia in many, many different ways. It would stop it from being able to transact business with the West, basically. Now, the last time you and I spoke, I think it was about 5 months ago, everything was more or less peachy keen between Biden and Putin. They had that summit in Geneva, and Biden put down some unspecified red lines. But I think this time, the U.S. having very, very good intelligence and having consulted with its allies and shared this intelligence. Things are, I mean, the capitals in Europe where I've just come from are on high alert right now. And that's a good thing, because I don't think that a lot of the warning signs that have appeared have been taken seriously by the West.
So yeah, that's major. There are conversations about sanctions. I don't know if sanctions have really worked before. Is there anything left in the sanction toolbox that would have an impact on Russia?
Yeah, you know, I think we have to regard Russia as one of the over-sanctioned countries in the world. I think they've gotten used to it. They've adapted. And Anne-Marie, beneath the surface there, what has been happening is the Russian heavy industry, the tech industry, have been invited to, for example, to do business with the Russian armed forces. So any big company that has lost business from the West because of sanctions has this kind of buffer. So it's sad to say the diplomatic toolbox is very empty right now for the West to pressure Russia. But again, that removal of Russia from that international payment system, as well as provision of sophisticated armaments to Ukraine, would be a big help. So far since 2014, the U.S. has given about $2.5 billion in assistance and $400 million for 2021 alone. That includes those anti-tank Javelin missiles too.
And what about Vladimir Putin's toolbox? It seems as if, you know, the Kremlin has been trying to take control of the energy supplies to the continent. Much of Europe is actually preparing for potential gas shortages. Can you expand on how Vladimir Putin could use energy as a political tool in response to sanctions or, you know, any other restrictions that may be imposed on them?
Sure. Well, Vladimir Putin is very masterful at causing alarm bells to go off in the West and threatening Ukraine without even firing a single shot. And one of their tools, as you pointed out, is that energy, specifically gas, which Russia has a lot of. And right now, nearing completion and approval is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which will bring even more Russian gas into Europe, which right now is in an energy crisis. So if Mr. Putin is unhappy and he wants to put pressure on the West or on Ukraine, it's easily done. And Anne-Marie, speaking of that toolbox, the other thing Mr. Putin has, of course, are those Russian-backed rebels in eastern Ukraine. And what they've been doing in the past few days, and not a lot of people seem to notice this, but it's unprecedented and it's really important, is they've been blocking my former colleagues, the OSCE international observers, from going through the Donbass, that occupied area, and detecting what's going on. This is a really, really important early warning sign instrument. And with that happening, it seems even more ominous to me with the situation we're in right now.
You know, Putin is demanding guarantees that NATO will not expand further east or place weapons close to Russian territory. The thing about it is, you know, the last time Russia invaded Ukraine and took control of Crimea, the Ukrainian military was in a very different position. It was a much easier lift for the Russians. It would be harder this time around. So I would expect that no one really wants to see military action. President Biden has already said that he's not going to accept any red lines. Is there common ground? What could these two men possibly agree on to ensure that tensions do not escalate?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In 2014, when I first arrived in Ukraine as part of the OSCE, I mean, the Ukrainian military was basically poised facing the West. Now they're facing the East. And we visited them on the front lines, and they were in flip-flops. They hardly had any weapons. But a big game changer right now, Anne-Marie, is the provision by Turkey of those very sophisticated drones, armed drones, that were such a big hit in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So this has taken out Russian positions like never before, and that has set off alarm bells in the Kremlin. So to get to your question, I think Mr. Putin, despite his frequent shows of confidence, he is quite concerned that Ukrainian armed forces are better prepared. They have better training, including where I sit from Canada. So I think, you know, if Biden is able to say these are the red lines and you do not cross them, but one more point, which makes this thing even more complicated. If the West were to accept NATO into its, Ukraine into NATO membership and give it EU membership as well, that could be a provocation for Putin that he cannot resist, that he could invade Ukraine. And right now, just quickly, I think what they're looking at is not a full invasion of the country, but just to build a land bridge between Russia and the Crimea, because Crimea is very difficult to service, a big territory, by just a bridge alone.
And so is that, you know, the end game here? What is the end game for Russia? Is it to make sure that, you know, Ukraine doesn't become a member of NATO? You know, when they overtook Crimea, there was this argument that Russia sees Crimea as part of its territory, that there are many ethnic Russians there. But now we're sort of talking about going beyond that. So, you know, what is the end game here?
Yeah, 2 or 3 quick points here. So one is when President Zelensky was elected a couple of years ago, what Putin did is he started handing out Russian passports to residents of the Donbass. So there are now, I think, about 400,000 or 500,000 Russian passports with people there, and he could use that as a pretext to invade Ukraine. But I think, you know, Putin wrote an essay earlier this year, 5,000 words no less, saying that Ukraine and Russia have to have a historical unification because we are one people. I think at the end of the day, Putin is also under pressure as well by his own intelligence services. After that invasion of Crimea in 2014, they're very confident. After those cyber attacks that had hit the United States, there are kind of power centers in the Kremlin that are pressuring Mr. Putin to move forward and do this big land grab. Let's hope we are all wrong and peace is restored and we have a ceasefire, which has eluded Ukraine for a long time. But I can't tell you what a very, very dangerous time we could be in right now with Ukraine.
All right. Michael Bociurkiw, thank you so much.
Thank you.